Hello, John Hively here. This is going to be, this is episode 2 of the history of the modern oligarchy in the United States. Now, as you recall, in the first oligarchy, or the first era of oligarchy in the United States, when the nation was ruled pretty much by people like the richest man in the nation, Andrew Mellon, and the Rockefellers, Henry Ford, and others. The Great Depression pretty much crushed their finances. Like 95% of their share prices were gone. Their wealth was obliterated, except in their land holdings. But even land prices collapsed during the Great Depression. FDR was the anti-establishment candidate, and he and numerous other anti-establishment candidates rode through the 1932 elections and threw out the establishment candidates of both major political parties. Anyway, the Supreme Court, as I mentioned before in the last episode, the Supreme Court was the last bastion of the old order, of the old oligarchy. It was their last hold on power. And they used the oligarchy, they used the Supreme Court to strike down many of the New Deal programs intended to help working people and to pull the nation out of the Great Depression, in which, recall, when the day Roosevelt took office, March 4th, 1933, the unemployment rate stood at I think on March 1st, it was 24.9%. But later on in March, like the first week, like after March 7th or so, I read that as much as 25.3% of the nation's workers were unemployed. Anyway, so the Supreme Court went about striking down New Deal legislation after New Deal legislation. In 1936, the court struck down a New York minimum wage law, New York state minimum wage law. The ruling outraged the nation. On May 18th, 1936, the court's merry make-believers, because they're just making stuff up, pretended the Constitution's Commerce Clause did not apply to nationwide industries such as coal mining. FDR worried that the Supreme Court would strike down other acts of his that were coming through the court system, the lower courts, such as the Wagner Act, the National Labor Relations Board Act, the Social Security Act, unemployment insurance, and other things that would help the nation. Anyway, Attorney General Homer Cummins told FDR, and I quote, "Mr. President, they mean to destroy us," referring to the Supreme Court. "We will have to find a way to get rid of the present membership of the court." Well, FDR struggled with that, but in the 1936 elections, he won re-election by record margins in 1936. He won 48 states and 98% of the electoral votes. His Democratic Party enlarged its Senate majority from 60 to 68, and the Democrats also picked up 13 seats in the House of Representatives. With that triumph of public opinion, FDR decided to fight back as hard as he could by threatening to enlarge the court. That is, he wanted to add several more justices, and he wanted to take it, I believe it was from 9 to 13 justices. There were 9 on the court, there still are. And he wanted to pack the court is what it was called. He wanted to add 4, 5, 6 more. In this way, he could place justices on the court who were not who were not there to do the bidding of the oligarchs. He was there to put justices on the court to ensure that the oligarchs would be gone from government. The public debate raged for months. Then, in 1937, Associate Justice Owen Roberts, he had historically voted against New Deal reforms. He morphed into an actual, real Supreme Court justice. Why he changed his attitude is still a mystery. Perhaps Roosevelt's court-packing plan played a role. Maybe FDR's overwhelming victory in the elections compelled him to switch from the dark side. Possibly, FDR had dug up dirt on Roberts and convinced him to morph into a real justice. One person, the Ohio State University political scientist named Gregory Caldera, suggested the Supreme Court fantasy writers may have outmaneuvered the president by retreating. He noted that either they were faced with either having to go with the New Deal reforms to approve them and say they were constitutional, and they were, or see the structure of this court changed, and the justices decided, okay, we want to keep the structure of the court intact. So that's what happened. Who knows why Owen Roberts, Associate Supreme Court Justice of the United States, decided to change. But regardless of the reason for the change in the court's position, FDR was able to shelve his court packing plan because of it. FDR appointed 8 of the next 9 justices during his 12 years in office. The first 4 came from working class, poverty backgrounds instead of from upper class backgrounds. In a 5-4 vote, the court ruled in favor of a Washington state minimum wage law, nearly identical to the New York law that the court had rejected just 3 months earlier. 2 weeks later, the court ruled in favor of the National Labor Relations Act. In a stunning reversal, the court decided coal mining did in fact fall under the Constitution Interstate Commerce Clause. It's amazing. Isn't it amazing? On May 24th, 1937, the court ruled the Social Security Act was constitutional, reversing a 1935 decision that said federal pensions were unconstitutional. From 1937 to 1969, the court's attitude toward working people and democracy shifted from negative to positive. That's because the Supreme Court and all the other areas of the Congress and the presidency, the oligarchs have been removed from power. But like Voldemort, if you remember the Harry Potter series, the movies, the books, whatever, Voldemort had touched the baby Harry Potter's head, inflicted a scar on his head, but somehow there was some sort of magical power that the baby had, and Voldemort was reduced to a shadow. In the same way, the oligarchs were reduced to a shadow. They still had some power and some influence, but they had been reduced to a shadow. But like Voldemort, they looked for ways to resurrect and to reassert power, and that was coming. During the years from 1937 to 69, the court's attitude during those years, the wealthy suffered a bit as fantasies favoring them, such as those used in ruling that separate was equal in Plessy versus Ferguson was reversed in Brown v. Board of Education, 1954. FDR's justices were skeptical of the fairy tales the previous black-robed fantasy writers had conjured up to ensure a government of, quote, the rich, the wise, and the good, which was really the rich, the not-so-wise, and the greedy. Nonetheless, for example, Associate Justices William Douglas and Hugo Black advocated the court reversed such fantasy stories as that backed up the Santa Clara decision of 1886. The legal precedent based on make-believe favoring the wealthy and their corporations. Nonetheless, thanks to the Great Depression and FDR, real democracy finally existed in the United States. Democracy reduced the political and judicial powers of the billionaires so they could no longer use those powers to redistribute massive amounts of income from everybody else to themselves. The result was excellent because all of a sudden you had a massively strong middle class, and it was growing. Prosperity was achieved for a lot more people than previously. For example, in 1929, the top 1% received 22% of all the income produced in the United States. That was the year the stock market reached its zenith and the Great Depression began. By 1976, the top 1% share of income had plummeted, had been nearly halved. More than halved to 10.4%. In 1929, the bottom 90% of citizens earned 30.9% of the nation's income, which meant virtually all of them were in some sort of poverty or near poverty situation. By 1976, the bottom 90 percentile of citizens earned 55.7% of the income produced in the United States. And wealth is different than income. Income is the cash coming in, baby. Wealth is what you own, such as houses, stocks, bonds, mortgage-backed bonds, things of that nature, cars. In 1929, the top 1% owned nearly 50% of the nation's wealth. 1%, 50%, they owned 50%. By 1978, the 1%, they only owned 21.8% of the nation's wealth. In 1929, the bottom 90% owned only 15% of the nation's wealth. By 1978, the bottom 90% was up to owned 26% of the nation's wealth. That's where you got the middle class, baby. It's because of the New Deal and because the first oligarchs were thrown out. But just like Voldemort, those first oligarchs and those that came after them, that were members of the oligarchy, the rich folks, the billionaires, whatever you want to call them, they were looking in the shadows. They were shadows, but they were looking and plotting to come back. And in 1968, they made their first move. And we'll get to that in episode 3. But before we get to episode 3, and we're not doing that today, I want to say something what FDR warned us about. He said, ever since, and I'm quoting here, ever since 1776, that struggle has been between two forces. On the one hand, there's been a vast majority of our citizens who believe that the benefits of democracy should be extended and who are willing to pay their fair share to extend them. On the other hand, there's been a small but powerful group which has fought the extension of those benefits, and he means the extension to everyone else, because it did not want to pay a fair share of their costs, but the American people will be neither bluffed nor bludgeoned. President Roosevelt was wrong. So the next episode deals with the rise of the new oligarchs, because the United States, you can say, has been sliced into two sections. One, you had an oligarchy for about 150 years. The Great Depression and the next following several decades, they were gone, and then they rose up again. So you have the new oligarchies. Anyway, you have a good time. Thanks for listening. Remember to share, like, and subscribe. Get the word out. I've got a battle plan to end all this crap, to end the oligarchy, and I think it'll work. Anyway, have a good one. Bye.